I'm Jennifer Campbell, creator and host of the Systemic Leadership Summit. Welcome to today's session. And in this session, we'll be talking about complexity, the dynamics in living human systems, and how we take adaptive action to actually deal with complex issues and situations. My guest for today will invite us to take on new views and alter our assumptions so that we can see and understand patterns in our systems. We'll explore her knowledge and extensive experience in this session, and her name is Glenda Eoyang. Glenda works with public and private organizations to help them thrive in the face of overwhelming complexity and uncertainty. She's a pioneer in the applications of complexity science to human systems, and she founded the field of Human Systems Dynamics, ASD for short. Through Human Systems Dynamics Institute, where she serves as founding executive director, Glenda uses her models and methods to help others see patterns in the chaos that surrounds them, understand the patterns in simple and powerful ways, and take practical steps to shift chaos towards coherence. The ASD associate networks include over 800 scholar practitioners around the world, and they are certified to apply her principles of adaptive action and pattern knowledge in diverse sectors, including education, healthcare, government, and philanthropy. Now, Glenda received her doctorate in Human Systems Dynamics from the Union Institute and University in 2001, studying under Dr. Donald Klein and Kevin Dooley. There, she discovered three fundamental factors that influence the dynamics of self-organizing change in human systems. This research forms the foundation for the body of work that helps individuals, institutions, and communities respond to the challenges and uncertainty of complex change. With colleagues around the world, Glenda delivers a hybrid of education and consulting in the form of adaptive action laboratories. The HSD Institute hosts a monthly free webinar in which Glenda shares her current research and emerging learnings. Her published works include scholarly articles in a variety of fields and Radical Rules for Schools, Adaptive Action for Complex Change, published in the ASD Institute in March 2013, and also Coping with Chaos, 7 Simple Tools, published in Lagumo Press in 1996. Recent chapters focus on organization and personal resilience in uncertainty, systems evaluation in healthcare, and an emerging praxis in conservation science. Glenda's latest book, with co-author Royce Holliday, is Adaptive Action, Leveraging Uncertainty in Your Organization, Stanford University Press, April 2013. It is a roadmap for anyone who chooses to work at the intersection of order and chaos. And I'm very excited that she's here today, and I would like to very warmly welcome you to the summit, Glenda. Thank you so much for being here with us.
You're welcome, Jennifer. I'm glad to be here.
And so let's start off with the context of our summit, because we are very much about helping leaders and everyone else who's interested in the systemic to create a paradigm shift in the way we define, shape, and experience leadership in the world. And this world is becoming more and more complex. Now, the way we look at the world and deal with problems really depends on our beliefs and assumptions. And so, in general, but specifically also for leaders who are trying to solve problems in this complex world, what are some of the assumptions, in your opinion, that we need to shift in order to deal with complexity and realize this paradigm shift?
Jennifer, that's a great question. In fact, that's what my next book is going to be about.
Oh, okay. Do you have a title yet?
There Be Dragons.
There Be Dragons. Wow.
And that's because in ancient times when they built a map and they'd get to the edge of the known universe, they'd see monsters and dragons out in the edges. And I believe that that's where we're standing now in terms of leadership. The thing that is the biggest need for transition is to be able to live in uncertainty.
Yeah.
And we as leaders have always thought that it was our job to map the known territory.
Yeah.
And to share it with people and to guide people along a map of known space. But today, as leaders, we're having to look beyond the known, step outside of what is historically agreed upon, clear, into the unknown. So the name of the book is There Be Dragons.
Yeah.
So the first assumption I think we have to change.
In
a way, addicted to certainty.
Yeah.
It's in the West. I think this is less true in the East and in the global South. But we expect ourselves and expect those who work with us not to move forward until we're certain. The problem is, in a complex system that's open and with lots of variables and lots of massive interdependence, you can never be certain. So if you're trying to be certain before you act, you can't be certain, you're in a trap. You can't go anywhere. And so this question about how do we build the capacity to live and act responsibly, even in the midst of uncertainty, is the center of leadership for the future, I believe.
Right.
There are assumptions that comes to. But I wonder whether this question of uncertainty you've also seen in leadership theory and practice.
Yeah, definitely. And it's so interesting how I love the metaphor about the dragons, because it's like, okay, we get to the edge of the definable and the controllable, and then we use this mythical animal to sort of symbolize this, but it also symbolizes that something needs to be conquered. And in my experience, many leaders are actually moving into this space, willingly or unwillingly, where they simply experience a world where they can no longer hold all the control. And so they are forced to deal with the uncertainty. So it's also entering the leadership development and the leadership definition field from experience with leaders. But it's so important to understand is that this assumption that you're referring to is an underpinning of our very idea of what leadership actually is.
Absolutely. And I think that brings us to what seems to us the second most important assumption, and that is that leadership must move from expertise to inquiry. And to hold both in mind at the same time. So expertise has been the background and the expectations that we have of ourselves and our clients and our staffs. Expertise. But in uncertainty, inquiry becomes the key for moving forward. How do you ask questions? How do you step into possibility and still hold the expertise? So there are some things that are predictable and controllable, and that as leaders, we'd be derelict in our duty if we didn't. On the other hand, there are things that way to ask a good question is the only expertise. So that leaders needing to be able to work at both of those extremes, but more than that, to know what's fit for function in a moment and to provide that to the system. So sometimes in my leadership role, I realize what my staff and I need is to play out my expertise the ways that I have it. There are other times when my staff needs me to stand back in inquiry with them to explore what might be possible. And that my leadership gift, insofar as I practice it, is to be able to find a useful place along that continuum at any moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is what we think of as the leadership journey.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I love this notion about fit for function. And because what I encounter in many sort of approaches to the systemic is that there's this tendency to swing the pendulum all the way to the other side, from control based to completely systemic, and that there's nothing that fits into the experience category that you just mentioned, because that's now old and actually maybe no longer the desirable thing to say or to move towards, particularly in the minds of some people who are big fans of the systemic. And for a while, I actually also found myself there. But it's about what is the fit for function in the moment that the system needs, like you just mentioned with your in your organization and from your leadership role and what your staff need. And so it's not just having experience, it's not just the skill of asking the right questions, but actually knowing where to be um, in a particular situation with your system.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
And so, on the one hand, it makes leadership more open and relaxed because you know that at any moment you can shift to another place as the system needs you to. So, there's a kind of comfort and confidence in that.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, it's pretty scary when you think there's high risk to be in the wrong place in the wrong moment. And so, how do we as leaders balance that sense of risk and freedom of exploration in these times? Those are the kinds of emotional responses I think that people are dealing with or
Yeah.
need to deal explicitly with.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right that there are people both in the systems world and in the complexity world who, in order to be heard early in the evolution of those fields,
Mm-hmm.
they had to denigrate the other side. They had to demonize the other
Yeah.
and explore in order to get attention on the pole that was emerging.
Mm-hmm.
I think that what that does is simply replicate the limitations of the mechanistic paradigm.
Yeah.
So, and when you think about how paradigms come to be, it's not that there was one paradigm here, and a new paradigm is dug over here. If you've read Kuhn, you know, paradigms move like this. This is the old paradigm, and the new one absorbs the old and expands beyond it.
Yeah.
Expands beyond it. And so, can we think of the world of expertise and command and control as being within a special case within the larger frame of openness and inquiry and complexity and systemic thinking? And that allows you then to hold them all in your heart and your head and your hands at the same time so that you have more flexibility and choices as a leader.
Yeah, yeah. And so, what I gather from the two assumptions that you just shared with us, and also as you were moving your hands, um, what I'm sensing is that expansion is very much the movement that comes from it. There is a paradigm, and then there's a bigger one, and an expanding from that can hold the previous paradigm and the new one that's emerging, and then some. And I guess that when we speak about uncertainty and the addiction to certainty, it's actually very contracting. It's something that doesn't let go. There's not so much space as when you get more comfortable and relaxed with uncertainty. Does that
Yeah.
make sense? I just had because you were moving your hands, I had a sort of more like a physical or kinesthetic understanding of what you were saying also. And I wanted to go there for a second, because what I noticed is that many leaders or people in general, when we're talking about leadership and paradigm shifts, it can easily become very brainy. And so it's great to also have like a a kinesthetic or movement type of understanding, that it's about the expanding also that is going to support the change of these assumptions of one dealing with uncertainty, and two, the other one of expanding and holding experience and inquiry. Yeah.
Mm. It's true. This idea about embodied learning and um, tactical.
Yeah. Sometimes I use it
Tactile is the word I was looking for.
tactile or kinesthetic or.
So the tactile perspective and the emotion and the arts and embodiment are critically important at this time, because in that world beyond, we don't have language yet
No.
for it. We don't have words. We don't have theory to describe it yet. That's growing, and there's some attempts at naming it. But when we're moving into a space where we don't yet have a language,
Mm-hmm.
all those other ways of knowing become critical in that transition space.
Yeah.
So I think that tactile kinesthetic space is important.
Mm-hmm.
There is something about the expansion I need to go back to for a second.
Okay.
The expansion, yes, it is expanding, and a healthy complex system also contracts.
Okay.
So you might zoom in to control and care and constraint for protecting, and then expand out to something else, and then contract again and expand. And this is the pathway of change in a complex system as we understand it.
Yeah.
Some people think about change as being from A to B, and we think about change as being expansion to bring in new information, new possibility, and then contraction for sense making and application, and expanding and contracting. Mathematicians in complexity call that the baker transform, because that's what a baker does with bread. They stretch it out and then they fold it back, and they stretch it out and fold it back. And what that does is to build resilience in the dough, makes the grains longer and more resilient, so that when the bread starts to rise, it doesn't collapse.
Okay. Wow.
This is what we believe happens in changing human systems. You find out new, make sense of it. You travel abroad and you come home. It's the hero's journey of myth. You go out and you come back. And every time you do that as an individual or a team or an organization or culture, you come back transformed and more prepared for the next expansion.
Yeah.
That's the space that we think leaders hold.
Yeah. And I find that thank you for that explanation, because I find that so fascinating. It's like ebb and flow movements and things that we know from ecosystems also. We're talking about leadership, and it's, for me, I also look at it, the opening and the closing of the boundaries of a system, where you just said new information can come in, and then the boundary closes so that the information can be worked with and strengthened before the complex system creates more complexity and then opens up again. So it's a fascinating process, and also I love how you describe it. And the more metaphors we have around that, the better, I think. So
in those types of transition. There's an example that I can give you that we've been working with in the Institute, middle of January.
Yeah.
At that point, we began a strategic foresight process to begin to think about, our question was, what's the influence of HSD in the world in 2051?
Wow. And how did you get to that specific year or time frame?
Well, it's a good question. We wanted to be far enough out that those of us who are holding the reality now across the network will be less in control or less central to the network. And it turns out that I named the field in 2001 as I was finishing my doctorate.
Okay.
And so 50 years after the field was named, we selected 2051. And this design of this process has included invited all 800 of our network members and has focused in on 2 or 3 people who are doing particular design and planning for the Institute. We've scanned many, many horizons for futures information, and then we sorted and set it. Then we wrote scenarios, which expanded again. Then we made sense of the scenarios and came to a vision. And now we're at a backcasting stage where we're saying, what are the implications of that vision in the world, which will then fold back in, not just for the field as a whole, but also for each of the individuals who are engaged.
Yeah.
And so role in leadership was to design this process, but also to adapt it and adjust it as we went through, because I could not possibly have known at the beginning where it would lead by 9 months hence.
Yeah.
And it's been an intentional exploration process of adding information and meaning making throughout. It's been delightful and incredibly surprising and somewhat frightening as for my leader of this field.
Yeah, yeah, especially because knowing that the leadership role you fulfill now, you may very likely not fulfill so many years down the line, and that the system will have changed and evolved and adapted. And zooming in and out to the possibilities and doing that across many decades to see then what that means for the here and now is a different way of expanding again and expanding and contracting again. And so as we're talking about this, are there any additional assumptions in order for us to be able to do that? And of course, I'm also curious why you decided to do this future pacing process. But I was just thinking, if leaders want to engage in changing our beliefs and assumptions so that we can become more fluid and deal better with complex situations and use systemic approaches to do so, are there any other assumptions that that you invite them to also change or question or look at?
It's a good question. It's a long list, and it depends on being fit for function. There are two that I'd like to share with you. One is that we believe that leadership, in essence, is setting conditions for others to succeed.
Yeah.
So that means if I'm the janitor, I'm setting conditions for others to succeed, and that's my leadership role. And if I'm a CEO or if I'm the head of the World Bank, that my job is to set conditions for others to succeed. But then what I have to do is to understand what those conditions are now, what they might be that would be more productive or constructive or creative, and then how to shift the conditions so that they prepare the space for other people to step into their power and possibility.
Yeah. And so the shift in the assumption then, is that the way you go about that process?
Exactly. So the shift is, I don't think about I'm leading this person or this person or this person. But I think instead is, it's my job to set the conditions so that wherever they are and wherever they are, and whatever happens to them in this uncertain world, that I'm setting conditions that are going to help them succeed regardless of what might happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm leading by engaging and setting an environment as opposed to leading this person and this person like a flock of people. But that's the assumption. But what that means is then as a leader, I have to be adept at seeing patterns that are present, understanding them, and influencing them, and then seeing what happens. And that we call adaptive action.
Yeah.
Seeing. So what does it mean? Now, what are you going to do? And as a leader, that's my engagement with this uncertain world, is in that adaptive action.
Yeah. Yeah. And so thank you for sharing that. And so when we sum up the 3 assumptions that we look at so far and your invitation to as an underpinning for a paradigm shift, you say it's about getting off the addiction to certainty. It's about holding the experience and the inquiry, and using that fit to function. And then there's the redefining of what leadership means and how you shape it, and how adaptive action is a way to do just that and to step into that. And these are already three really strong ones. And I am just thinking, in 2 days, I'm going to be sitting with a group of executives of a global organization. And we didn't put the systemic on the agenda. That's still one of my bigger dreams. But I am going to be preparing them for an announcement of a change in their company. And as I'm sitting here and thinking about that, what do you encounter when you work with leaders and you invite them to, like, shift into these type of assumptions that you just shared, and they're like, Glenda, I'm sorry, but I'm not sure if I can do that or if I'm willing to do that. So what is your take on when you find this type of response, or what is your take on how do we make this internal journey first before we're actually able to make these shifts in assumptions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, one thing is to look at readiness. And I believe that everybody is ready for this paradigm shift. They're just not all ready in the same way. So,
Ah,
my job as a guide is to help people find and touch the place where they're ready. And the way we do that is to ask them, what's their wicked issue? What's the thing that keeps them awake at night? What's the thing that they have not been able to solve? Because that's where they're ready to try something new.
right.
When I talk to a leader who thinks, oh, I've got everything under control, or they're not willing to admit to themselves or to me that there are things that are beyond their immediate understanding and action,
Yeah.
I know that either I need to work with them more to find their spot of readiness, or they're not willing or able to pull back the curtain and share that spot of readiness. So that's the first thing, to focus in on what it is that they see is not possible given their current thinking and action,
Yeah.
current mind action. So that's the first thing. That's to find the spot of readiness for them. And
Mhm.
we sticky issue, we call it wicked problem, we call it what keeps you awake at night. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we find most useful is 4 rules for inquiry. Because it's one thing to say to somebody, you should be in inquiry. And they say, well, I ask questions all the time. I ask, why didn't you do? I ask questions. But to say instead, what are the questions that will be most useful? And
Ah,
people need to do that. We don't know how to ask good questions. So in HSD, we have 4 rules for being in inquiry. And I find that leaders really resonate with these, and it gives them a place to go. So the first rule is turn judgment into curiosity.
okay. Turn judgment into
Into
curiosity.
curiosity. So not only does the leader need to do that, but they need to invite their systems to do that as well.
Hmm.
So when you're moving into a change, the first thing people are going to have is judgment about it. This isn't going to work. This is scary. This is a stupid idea. This is whatever. But if the leader can say, I invite you to turn that judgment into curiosity, not to deny the judgment, it's there. Don't pretend like it's not supposed to be there. It just goes underground. But how can you transform that judgment into curiosity?
Yeah.
The second rule is to turn conflict into shared exploration. So if you and I are in conflict about something, how can we name what it is that we're both curious about so that we can look at it outside rather than focusing on our conflict between? So conflict into shared exploration.
Yeah. Yeah.
The third, and this is really a challenge for, I think, all leaders, including me,
Hmm.
turn defensiveness into self-reflection. So that when I am feeling defensive
Hmm.
about it that I'm making or might be making, or when someone else is feeling defensive in my presence, how do I turn that into self-reflection? How do I ask myself, what is it that I have done to set conditions for this pattern to emerge? And then the fourth is turning assumptions into questions. So judgments into curiosity, conflict into shared exploration, defensiveness into self-reflection, and assumptions into questions. And I find that that gives a kind of roadmap for individuals and groups to practice inquiry, not just to promise it.
Mm. Wow, what hits home for me as you're mentioning these 4 different rules for asking questions is that the judgment and the conflict and the defensiveness and the assumptions, um, let me just put it that way, in my world, are very contracting or boxing in, and that things you want to invite people to go into. So in terms of the curiosity and the exploration and the questions, and I'm forgetting one, but those
Assumptions.
and that they are that those are all the invitation to open up your boundaries instead of holding them closed and sort of survival, or that you're actually asking people to open up their boundaries to let the new information in. And those are all different ways of opening up the boundaries for new information. Because if new
Indeed.
information
Yes.
cannot come in, then it's very difficult to ask questions.
Yeah. And one of the ways that we talk about that distinction between the closed world and the open world is that in the closed world of judgment and defensiveness and conflict and assumptions.
Yeah.
There are problems that need to be solved. You know what the problem is, you know what the solution is, you know where you're going. You can hire a consultant in to get, and it's a world of expertise and answers to problems.
Yeah.
When you get in the open world, they aren't really problems to solve. They're not solvable. They're patterns to be engaged with and influenced. So if you think about climate change, or you think about poverty, or you think about employee engagement, or you think about fear, that's not a problem to be solved. There's not a list of best practices that will let you solve that problem. It's a pattern.
Yeah.
Pattern that you must see as a leader, understand and influence, but it's a pattern. It's not a problem to solve.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean I don't have problems. As a leader, I do have some problems that need to be solved. But when I'm dealing with something that is not solvable, it's full of uncertainty, that is changing so quickly and constantly, then I have to reframe the way that I think of it to see it as a pattern and not a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And so actually when we go back to that interaction with a leader, with a client, or for example the executives I'll be talking to soon, then there is this invitation. There's these four rules that help them to open up to asking questions. And when they start seeing patterns, is there then a next thing in terms of what to do with the pattern?
There is indeed, and you mentioned in your invitation, as you were opening, you mentioned the fact that I found 3 conditions for self-organizing systems.
Mm-hmm.
We say pattern, that's what we mean. That systems are self-organizing, that they're generating new patterns for individuals and groups and large groups and nations, and that there are 3 conditions that influence that process.
Yeah.
As it goes in what direction. And one of them is about the boundaries. So what are the boundaries that we're working in? So as a leader wants to influence patterns, one of the things they can do is to define what the boundary is. They do that by setting vision, setting goals, or setting time periods, or setting plans, or establishing organizational structures. What are the boundaries within which we're working? When I decided to do HSD 2051, that was setting a boundary within which we were going to plan.
Yeah.
I also say, what are our plans for this week? And how are we performing? Deciding what the size of the inquiry is to be. And sometimes that's very small and sometimes it's very large. But that's the first thing. How is the system bounded that we're into right now?
Yeah.
We're looking at individuals, individual transformation, or teams. The second characteristic of the pattern that you can influence is called the differences. What are the differences that make a difference? So as a leader, I can say, everything is about profit. Now, I may not say that explicitly, but I may say that in lots of ways. Yeah. And then the pattern that will emerge will be one of competition and possibly greed. Or I can say, we are about the difference of quality. The quality is the only thing that we think about, in which case it will be a pattern of commitment, but it may not serve clients so well because it might also be very expensive.
Yeah.
But if I say the difference is profit and quality, then I set a different pattern as a leader. So for a leader to say, what are the differences that make a difference around here? Mm-hmm. And we're seeing that, particularly in the US now, as corporations who fought regulation for climate change for decades are realizing that it is in their best interest to be concerned about regulatory use of problems in greenhouse gases, and that their responsibility now to come up with some social accountability to make a difference, it is they recognize a difference that makes a difference. And so as leaders, they're stepping into a different mode of leadership. So that's the second. What are the differences that make a difference? And then the third is about exchange. How are things connected? Who's talking to whom about what? What is the flow of resources? What's the flow of information? So those are the three things that leaders can do to shift patterns. Shift the containers or focus on certain containers. Shift the differences, few or many, for them to define them or to have the client define them, the market define them. And then the third is to connect things together or disconnect them. Basically, at its root, those are the ways that a leader sets conditions for others to be successful.
Right, right. And so as I'm listening to you and these three conditions, is that you're actually saying this is how leaders can create and facilitate patterns. Because if we create conditions that are along the lines of these that you just mentioned, then this is how we create the patterns, because others are then going to work with those. Is that the same as changing a pattern? So, for example, if a leader in their organization zoom out and they really look and they start asking questions and they discover patterns, and then work with these ways of setting the conditions for other people to work in, are they changing the patterns? Are they creating the patterns, or is that the same?
Oh, that's a good question. So the way we think about it is that there are always patterns there. That the pattern is, there is a pattern in the space already.
Yeah.
And that what we can do as leaders is to shift the condition so that the pattern changes, or reinforce the condition so the pattern holds. An example would probably be helpful. So
please.
Doing work with a group in the Yukon, up at the north of Canada. A group of individuals had come together in this community to create what they called U-Construct. And it was a makerspace. And there were just 5 or 6 of them who wanted to come together and build a makerspace. space. Well, an entrepreneur came and they decided to make it a co-work space. And then others came and then it got funding. And then those few people at the beginning became a board and they became a nonprofit so they could get grants. And over 6 years, it exploded.
Yeah.
Following each person's passion and possibility, which was great. What a wonderful way. And those early people had set conditions for that to happen because they focused on what individuals wanted to do. They accessed many different sources of resources, flooding money and resources into the space. So the container was enormous. Differences were enormous, and the exchanges were very many. And what they got was a big mess, a very, very successful, but a big mess. And they realized that there was a limit to the size, to the scale that they could have with this much stuff going on.
Yeah.
So they worked with us to see that pattern. They wanted to keep the energy. They didn't want it to become a bureaucratic something. They didn't want to kill it with regulations and controls, but they wanted something that would help shape it. So in the planning process, what we did was to begin to feed back to them what were the containers that were present. So they saw everything as mixed up. And we said, well, there's this group of people who are entrepreneurs. And in that circle, there's these certain differences that make a difference. And then there's this other group of people who are making native arts in this maker space, and that they're doing beading and they're doing leather work and their deep tradition and connection with elders are the differences that make a difference there. And then there are these group of kids who are just having a great time using the printer because they had never had a printer before. And so they were using the printer. And so they were education. So we began to show them that within this messy mass, there were very clear, coherent containers where there were differences, where there were connections that were useful. And that their job as a board was to build a big container that holds all of them and articulate what are the differences among those clusters and how could they be connected to see what might happen. And so we put for them what we call a strategic framework, which was an image, a graphic image of what the whole is, some simple rules for how it works together, some basic dichotomies, tensions that they're negotiating. And that then becomes their strategic framework rather than a strategic plan, so that every time they want to make a decision, they can come back and say, this is the pattern that we see. Does this new thing fit with the pattern? Is it shifting the pattern? If it's shifting it, is it a way that we want to? We simply saw what was there, made a pattern explicit, and then established the opportunity for them to make choices about whether to keep or to change that pattern. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. So what I actually hear you say is in this example, and thank you for sharing this, is that if you are very, very open in the rules with the patterns, then you create this system that very rapidly branches out into all these different fractals that it can be. And that what you did with this board is by helping them to work with the patterns to actually find the space where they could still fulfill their role of supporting others in doing their work well. And I can imagine that while clarifying the differences and where the connections are, there was a bit more space and a bit more understanding of what all the subsystems in the bigger systems, what they actually were and how they were moving and how they related to the bigger whole. And that there were new subsystems were emerging that they could actually see. Is this a manifestation of the pattern that we actually want to hold here, or not? And if it is, then what can we add to it, or what can we do in our way of working with the pattern that it remains adding in its all its differentiation to the bigger whole of what we're trying to do with this big system. And so I think it's an excellent example of what you can do when you experience a lot of chaos, and to without putting things in boxes necessarily, but to help leaders in helping the system define itself, and the subsystems to define itself, so that the subsystems can also get information about how are we different from the rest of the organization, and how are we contributing, and how are we connected to the bigger whole. And I think that this could be very valuable for leaders and organizations to have so much more, because what I see is a lot of fragmentation, especially in big multinational organizations, is that many spaces don't talk to each other, or are in uh, uh, almost a hostile type of disconnect, where if they knew how they were connected, and if they knew what the value of the differences that they bring, the organization as a whole could thrive so much more. Does that make sense? So,
well said, well said. In fact, often when you find across silos, people say, well, let's just get them together to talk to each other, as if the exchange would be. Often when they talk to each other, they just remember how much they hate each other, and that doesn't work. There are two other pathways, though. You can build a container that holds them both.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about what's the work that we're doing, like talking to customers to see what needs to be done, or innovation, or what are the possibilities for research and development in a space, so that you build the two into a single container,
Mm-hmm.
and then work together. Or you can focus on the differences. It's a little ironic, but if you go into such a space and you help the two see deeply how different, what their differences are and why they're different, and you keep pushing those differences, and they talk about how they're different, and they get really clear about that, and respecting each other for the differences, then suddenly they begin to see similarities and what holds them together. They see how much they need each other because they're clear about the differences. Whereas sometimes we try to fix silos by having people talk about how they're the same. And even if that might work in a short workshop, it's not sustainable.
No. I find it such a fascinating area, because we've been talking about leadership and assumptions, and about ways to work with patterns, and you mentioned the open and the closed worlds also, and this movement that we sort of have from the kinesthetic space. And now that we're talking about differences, we actually hold some different views about how to deal with differences in a system in the very context of the Systemic Leadership Summit. So I find that so fascinating that you bring it up, that what you're actually saying is, by having at least two subsystems come together and talk about how different they are, and having them do that in a way where they can respect each other for how different they are, then they'll start to find similarities. And I'm just pinpointing this out because I've had some other sessions in the Systemic Leadership Summit where the presumption is that it's important to start talking about the similarities first, because then the systems open more to interaction and collaboration, and then they can start talking about the differences. So what's your take on that? Now I'm explaining that there's at least two viewpoints. There are more, but these are the most sort of extreme ones. Where do you start? Do you start with the similarities or the differences?
So it's a great question, and it's another fit for function question.
Aha.
Right? So sometimes I would say, oh, this group really needs a common view. So with the Yukon project, the first thing we did was to build a vision that they shared. That was the first thing, because they were so diffuse.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, when I work in medical systems with physicians and with nurses and with other healthcare providers, where they're trying to build interdisciplinary service, the first thing I do is to have each of those groups talk explicitly about why they do what they do, what their scope of work is, why they're working as they are, why they chose such a, so that the differences are really clear, so that when they sit down to do interdisciplinary work,
Mm-hmm.
there's a depth of understanding of what's at the table.
Yeah.
It depends. One time one, sometimes the other. But the reason differences are so important in a system, and I don't know, I don't want to spend too much time on your 9th grade science class, but you may remember that potential energy is based on difference in physical systems.
Yeah.
So water flows downhill because there's higher and there's lower. And a spring holds energy because there's stretched out and there's condensed. Temperature holds energy because there's hot and there's cold, right? So it's the difference that holds potential energy in physical systems.
Yeah.
We think the same thing is true in a human system. That the difference in the system is a potential for change.
Yeah.
And unless you can touch a difference and release that potential, you're not going to be able to use the energy of the system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like a steam engine was an innovation that allowed us to turn the energy in wood or coal into energy to move forward.
Yeah.
We believe that difference in human systems is that way too. That what HSD lets you do is to take all of that energy that's locked into human systems and the differences and the boundaries, and to be able to accumulate it and transform it into health and happiness, coherence, well-being, productivity. That's what we're about, is to find the differences that are holding the most useful potential and to release that into the use of the individuals and groups that we're working with. Yeah. So that's why difference is so important. That's where the energy is locked.
Yeah.
In the difference.
Yeah. And so thank you for that explanation about differences, because what pops up for me is, so I'm back with my client and they're about to announce a change. And what they're actually doing is they're announcing a difference that they see in where the organization is now and where it needs to be in order to survive and thrive in their market. And I've been in the change management business for decades now. Makes me feel old, but it's true. And what I'm trying to see is, how does the systemic perspective, specifically on what you just mentioned about difference, how do you find that energy so that the organization can make the shift? Because the leadership sees the difference. The way we are now is not sustainable, and we need to change into something else to be sustainable and to grow or to cater for or serve our customers or whatever. But it's still sort of the partially the old way of looking at change. Oh, I see a problem. Let's fix the problem. Let's start a change project and go from A to B. And there is, I see a difference between where we are now and where we need to be. So do you understand what I'm saying? And this is where it gets slightly fuzzy for me in terms of working with leaders who haven't built their muscle yet in terms of the systemic views. So could you help me out here? Where is the energy of the difference that could then be harnessed for the organization to realize a change that helps them adapt?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to begin, just to say, remember the assumptions from the beginning, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Those leaders need to step out of their expertise and get into inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
So they think they know that this is the right way to go, but they have no idea what the ramifications are going to be across the board. They need to somehow rediscover their inquiry about this process.
Yeah.
As opposed to what we often do, if it's not moving, we just keep saying it harder and harder. So that's one thing. The second thing is for them to see this change as a pattern that is shifting, not as a train that's going down a track. It's not A to B. It is a migration of a population across a boundary of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of the difference, the one that I see most ignored in times of change, which is where the energy lies, is the difference among the levels of power in the system, in the hierarchy.
Yeah.
That the differences between executives and rising executives is an incredibly important difference. What one sees and what the other sees, and what opportunity is locked in there, the blindness that one has and the possibility another has, or between managers and rising executives. What is it that they see? How is their experience same and different? How does the pattern look same and different from where they're standing? And then to first line supervisors, and then to service providers. And so that difference among the perspectives and the levels of hierarchy is incredibly important.
Mm-hmm.
This is a difference that goes horizontally outside the organization. That leaders often think that they're leading bounded inside systems, and that their job is to define the problem of change in their system and make it happen. When in fact, more and more, every institution is functioning within the larger context, and they are a pattern within, but there are also patterns between and among. And for those leaders to see that broader, whether it's a time horizon or a space horizon or a market horizon or a demographic horizon,
Mm-hmm.
recognize how their system is playing within the larger system. So that's an important difference. And the difference level to level. And then you zoom down to the individual and you recognize that each individual has a subjective truth about that change.
Yeah.
Right or wrong, matching or not matching, like their neighbors or not, each person has a story, their own personal narrative that they're carrying. And that ultimately is the story that's going to make the change work or not.
Yeah.
So how can the leaders elicit those stories and make them true and see that there's also the global story that has to move forward, not get stuck in those subjective truths, but to allow them into a wider, richer pattern. And so those are the kinds of differences that we invite senior leaders to look at.
Yeah.
Because it's very easy to focus on that difference of past to future, on your mark, get set, go.
Yeah.
That's easy. But how's that working for us? Have you ever seen a place where it worked?
Very few.
Very few. And the places where I've seen it work, it's because even though the leaders didn't talk about it, what they were doing was leveraging their relationships up and down the organization out into the world. They didn't explicitly say it because they had to kind of do it in secret because nobody thought it was a good thing to do. But they're the ones who give the resilience to the system so that it's able to move forward together. And we can just make that explicit and give people the skills to do it and the courage and ability and autonomy, really.
Yeah. So for leaders to work with difference is also about knowing along which dimensions to actually look at difference, and maybe to go much more beyond the differences that you're used to looking at and looking for. And what also comes up for me is the realizing what is actually known and visible within the system, and enabling that to come up and then to putting it back into the right perspective again. So so it's great if leaders can expand the knowledge about what are all the narratives and what are all the differences between all the power layers within the organization, and beyond the borders of the organization, with customers or other stakeholders. And how do they all see and hold this change, and how is it similar or different? And then to put it back into some sort of container that enables the system to then move. And so what I want to ask you next is all of this the adaptive action process, or is that something else? What is the adaptive action process?
The adaptive action process is the engine that lets you do this. So
okay.
It's the engine that keeps the system moving. So the adaptive action is a really simple, though not always easy, but a simple process for collecting information, making decisions, and taking action. Three questions. What is the current pattern? So what are the differences that make a difference in this pattern? Now what can I do to either build a different container, focus on different differences, build other exchanges? What can I do? And then I do it. But I never know how the system's going to respond.
So it's what? What is the pattern?
What is the pattern?
So what? What are the...
So what are the current containers and differences and exchanges? What's the current pattern? So what are the tensions in it? And then now what can I do to leverage that tension?
Yeah.
To take action, to shift the conditions so something changes. What? So what? Now what? And as soon as I act, the system's going to respond somehow. I don't know how.
Yeah. And then a new pattern emerges, or a couple of patterns emerges.
And then I need to look and to do another what. And so that's the cycle. And it's happening for each individual person differently. So I'm a leader, I may have some issues and questions about my relationship to my senior executive team. So I'm doing, what's the pattern in the executive team? So what does that mean now? What do I need to do at the next meeting? At the same time, I may be looking at the economic state and saying, what's going to happen with the market tomorrow? What's the current state? What are the political things that are happening now? What's going to happen? Or I might be seeing someone in a cultural space and say, what's the culture of that particular factory? So what do I need to do now? What would that look like? So there are millions of adaptive action cycles that are going on, tiny ones, 100 in a meeting, and enormous ones that could be 10-year plans about what is our vision for going forward. So what are the possibilities in that now? What are we going to do to move that large vision?
Yeah. And so what you're actually saying, thanks for explaining this about adaptive action and the process behind that. What? So what now what? So it's what you're actually saying is, by the end of now what, it doesn't necessarily mean that you know how the response will be, but it's that adaptive process of going through these cycles over and over again, to create the conditions and to influence the patterns that are going on in the system in which you hold a leadership role. And so you're actually going to need these assumptions that we talked about in the beginning of our conversation. Because asking what, so what, now what, that comes from a place of inquiry rather than experience. Although experience you can very much maybe use in the now what, so now determining the action that you're taking. It also requires that you can deal with the uncertainty of not knowing exactly what the answer will be, because you're not coming from a place of, I need to control the outcome. I need to have a solution, but it's more about, oh, I'm influencing the pattern, and let's see what happens with the pattern once I do my adaptive action. And so, yeah, fascinating process, fascinating process.
Yeah.
And so,
And there's sometimes when you start, the what is, oh, this is a problem. It has a beginning and an end. It has a solution. I know what to do. So what resources do I need to get into do it? Now what am I going to do? I'm going to solve the problem. And the what is, oh, that solved it. Okay, so we can go in. So you can do this with a cycle of expertise,
uh-huh.
or do it with a larger space as well. So it works on a highly controlled system as well as on a system that's open.
Yeah. So the adaptive action process is actually a process that supports the shift in assumptions around, it's not either or experience or inquiry. It's about both of them and then some, where you can use this cycle. And so, um, during our conversation, you already mentioned a couple of examples of how you use this as a leader in your own organization. And we also talked about differences. And I want to ask about these two more before we close off. And going into the differences first, how would you say is human systems dynamics different from other systemic approaches?
Oh, that's another great question. So as you know, there are hundreds of systemic approaches.
Mm-hmm.
I think the three major distinctions between HSD and that whole body of work, one is that for most systems approaches, you have to honor a particular boundary before
Yeah.
you can talk about the system.
Okay.
So almost every systems perspective, in fact, all of them I know, say you begin by bounding the space. In HSD, we say you can do that, but only for a moment, because in your next adaptive action cycle, you may need to be a larger or smaller. You can zoom in and zoom out. So there's no particular scale that's honored in HSD. So that's one difference. A second difference is that we really focus on action. I'm a pragmatist at heart. And I believe that understanding things and knowing things is great,
Mm-hmm.
but it only really counts if you're able then to choose and take action on it.
Yeah.
And so our adaptive action cycle includes action. So our systems perspective is not to understand the system. That's not our goal. Our goal is to get enough insight into the system to take a next wise action.
Yeah.
So the purpose is the action. The purpose is not the understanding. So
Okay.
which means and which is the end. So in some systems perspective, action is the means toward understanding the system.
Mm-hmm.
But in
Yeah.
our understanding, is just a means to the end.
Yeah.
And the third way I think that's really important is that the uncertainty is a gift in HSD, the ability to hold uncertainty, and that the uncertainty is a necessary component, not to be destroyed, of the system. That there are things that we will simply never know. They are unknowable. And we had better bring them into our system rather than banish them beyond the line. Because unless we integrate them into our decisions, we will not be able to face a future as it's coming to be.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the three main distinctions between this and other systems perspectives. Now, another contrast is HSD and other complexity perspectives.
Right.
And there's a whole circle of complexity perspectives
Mm-hmm.
that holds some distinctions. One of them we talked about earlier, about seeing its complexity that banishes everything else as opposed to integrating both.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that help kind of place HSD in the ecology of systems thinking?
Yeah, and what I really appreciate also in some of those differences and um, is that it may help many of the people are viewing right now also in their own adaptive action in terms of what am I using this systemic approach for? Is it for me, for my understanding? Is it for me to take action? Is it for me to define the system, or is it for me to um, expand the system and the patterns that are in it? Or can I work with my own fluidity and can I maybe decrease my addiction to certainty without having uh, to completely kill it? Because I think that that edgy feeling we have around uncertainty can also keep us alert that that's something that can help us in our adaptive action also, and that it's always there. So that I think that this that the HSD perspective and approach can also help in thinking about and acting on what am I using this approach for. So thanks for speaking to that. And so what I'm really curious about, because the human systems dynamics is something that you brought into the world as it is today. And of course, we could talk for quite a long time about how that came about. I mentioned some of it in the introduction, and I'm sure that we maybe have another opportunity to talk about that. Um, but I'm curious about how did HSD not only influence your leadership, um, but also the systems in your own life, in your own work?
Yeah, do we have 5 hours? um, the first thing is that I had always been balanced on expertise and finding answers. I was quick and I was efficient and I was effective most of the time. And in the world that I was an entrepreneur in the late 80s, and I had everything under control. Company was great. It was great. And suddenly it didn't work anymore. Technologies changed, markets changed, cultures changed, globalization came, all my staff of about 30 shifted. And all of a sudden, that nicely well-behaved, expert-based world kind of was beginning to crash and burn a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I began looking for ways to think about the work differently. And I could not find other leadership or management literature that was useful at all. My background is in history and philosophy of science. And so after I read all the leadership and management gurus and kind of put them back on the shelf, I took a vacation and I thought I'm just going to relax and read a good book. And I read Glick's Chaos Making a New Science, which was about the first popular complexity book.
Mm-hmm.
And in it, I found explanations for what I had done that did work and explanations for why some of the things that I did not work.
Mm-hmm.
Began to see my world through that filter. So that was in about 1986. I wrote my first book in 96. And through that time, I was practicing and expanding and trying to make sense of things and trying to make them practical and simple. And then from 96 to about 2003, I was working on my doctorate and publishing and doing research in the field. And in 2003, I started the Institute.
Mm-hmm.
And the was to invite others into this inquiry with me, not to replicate what I had discovered, but to see what would happen if they took these same ideas and applied them in other places and times, and what they would see with their experience and their history and their place in their complex environments, and to plant the seeds and see what would grow. And so part of the real excitement in this HSD 2051 is to see what has grown.
Yeah.
As I planted those many seeds, and that the seeds are now having seeds. So that very picture of this endeavor is a manifestation of my belief that leadership is to set conditions for others to flourish. Yeah. And so that it has been, I can hardly even say that it's influenced my leadership. I think I'd have to say it has been my leadership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I am just realizing as we are talking, we've run out of time. And there's one more thing I want to ask you, and that is for everyone who is watching, because this has been a very rich conversation, I already want to say. And if there were any boundaries to what people take away from this session, if there was only a core of what we've exchanged in this time, then and if you were to have any say in that, what would you hope that people take away?
I hope that they take away a courage and an excitement about stepping into uncertainty,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about the patterns that they would influence, and using human systems dynamics, adaptive action, so that they would use what, so what, now what, to engage with curiosity and courage with the uncertainty that they've been trying to avoid.
Yeah. Glenda, we've come to the end of our conversation. And we've been talking about so many things, picked from your experience and all the examples around the assumptions and shifts in assumptions that you invite us to make so that we can create shifts in paradigms or shifts in patterns in how we shape our leadership in systems that are becoming more and more complex, and trying to navigate that also. We've been talking about, ways of dealing with uncertainty. We've been talking about adaptive action. We've been talking about patterns and your role as a leader, where you create the conditions for people, to function well and to contribute. We've had a couple of examples of where you work with leaders and help them to use human systems dynamics to actually, as I see it, make sense of the system they are serving, and continue to do so as it is changing and evolving. And we also talked about your leadership and how you use adaptive action not just as a thing to understand, but that the action is actually a goal or a means in itself, and not just the understanding of systems. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for this conversation. I truly enjoyed it. And thank you so much for being here with us in the summit.
You're very welcome. And thank you for the insight and leadership that you show in leading the summit, and to set this container for these exchanges about these differences. You HSD natural.
Thank you. Well, thank you. I do set very strict boundaries sometimes in order for this to work, but thank you so much. And to everyone who's been watching, I hope you also enjoyed this session. just as I have. And I'd like to invite you to share your experiences, or maybe even your inquiries and what, so what, now what cycles in your adaptive action after watching this session. So please go to our online community space and share it there. Thank you so much for watching. See you next session. Bye-bye.